Delay. Sorry for that delay. Are we good, Steph? All right. So here's a question. Was Judas present when Jesus instituted the Lord's Supper? Or to put it another way, did Jesus serve Judas communion? It's a question. And I bet it's a question you've never asked yourself. Maybe, but more than likely you've never considered this question because it's not one of those pressing things like, hey, what's for dinner? Or what time am I supposed to pick up the kids? Or which of these wide receivers do I start in fantasy football? Like the questions we ask ourselves that are truly important. It doesn't feel like it's one of those. And yet the fact of the matter is, if you look at our history as a church, as a religion, as a faith, this is one of those questions that seems to have not only been something that people have asked a lot and sort of almost obsessed over, but it's a question that hasn't always had a definitive answer. In fact, it's never had a definitive answer. The answer is really we don't know, but it's an interesting question that's asked over and over and over, dating all the way back to the 2nd, 3rd, 4th centuries, up through the Reformation. And sort of our rule of thumb is this, okay? If you find a writer who is writing in like 280 or 350 or 410 or whatever, like you find somebody from that period of church history, you are exceedingly likely to hear them, or I suppose to read them talking about how Judas was present for the Lord's Supper being instituted, that Jesus did serve Judas communion, and that has huge theological ramifications. If you fast forward in history, and you're still into like the 1500s, 1600s, 1700s, that kind of thing, all the way to today, you'll see you're much more likely to have people say, no, Judas wasn't there, and that's just the way it is, and that has big theological ramifications. Like, this is actually much more important than who it is that you are starting in fantasy football. Like, this is actually a really, really important question to a lot of people, and all you gotta do is Google it. Like, if you just Google it, like right now, don't do it now. You have terrible service in here anyway, so don't do it now. But if you Google it, you're going to find like article after article after article, and it's not just like the Catholics or the Orthodox or the Baptists or the Presbyterians or the Mormons, whoever. Like, it's everyone. Everyone has asked this question and come to their own conclusions about it. And so the question is, I guess our secondary question to the original question is, why? Like, why is this thing anyone cares about? And I think the answer to that, we can answer in a couple different ways. Practically speaking, there is a reason we have to ask this question, and it's the way that the New Testament is written. So just so we're all up to speed, okay, what we're talking about is the Last Supper, the Lord's Supper, which is instituted at the Last Supper, okay? So in case we're confused, okay, the last day that Jesus is alive, the last night that he's here, Jesus spends the evening with his family, his best friends, his closest disciples. And Jesus doesn't want to just spend the evening doing, bro stuff. He doesn't just want to, hang out with these guys. He wants to do something really special. He wants to do something, holy and sacred and meaningful that they'll always, always remember and will, be with them after he's gone. And as luck would have it, it's the Passover. And so he decides to have a Passover meal with them. The Passover is, very simply, it is the most important festival, holiday, whatever you want to call it, on the Jewish calendar. The Passover is basically like it's a very, very proud of their their nationalistic identity. It's something that's distinctly Jewish that goes back to their formation as a nation. It's something that goes back to their religion, with how they understand who God is, who God is, how God operates, the sorts of things God does, how God has protected them, how God has been faithful to them, how God has led them. It's all about God, and it's all about who they are as people who are chosen by God, who are religious people. So you kind of tick every box, right? So like it's theological for God, it's very practical for who they are as a country, it's very spiritual for who they are as people, and the Passover is just the absolute, it's everything that is Judaism wrapped up in one act. And the Passover meal, therefore, is the type of thing you do, and they did it, once a year, the type of thing you would do with the people you were closest to, with your family. This is basically a family moment of remembrance, who God is, who we are as a people. Well, Jesus' family is his disciples. And so it only makes sense that he says, I want to, share a Passover with you guys. And that'll be the last thing that we do. And it was at the end of that meal, during that whole thing, they go through the Passover stuff, and then Jesus actually builds off of the Passover idea. He builds off of it. He goes and he kind of extends it, if you would. So the Passover is for Jewish people. And Jesus says, I want to add something to this. I want to build off of this, using that as the foundation. I want to build off of that and make something that is uniquely yours, that's uniquely you, that is for people who are following me. And so he took some bread and he thanked God for it, and he broke it, and he told them, this is my body broken and given for you. And he took a cup of wine and he poured it, and he thanked God for it, and he said, this is my blood shed for you. And he told them that in this bread and in this wine, he said, that is the new covenant of God, which is a fancy way of saying this is a new understanding, a new agreement, a new promise, a new relationship with God. And everything that is this relationship with God that we have through Christ is wrapped up in these two emblems, his body and his blood. It is him saying that he is the one who is making what we know of God, what we know of God. This relationship with God that we have is being purchased, bought, sacrificed for. I mean, there's all sorts of illustrations, but it's being done unilaterally by Jesus. This is something Jesus does on our behalf for us. It is God's offering to us, is maybe my favorite way of putting it. And that's the institution of the Lord's Supper. We call it communion. You could call it the Eucharist. You could call it a lot of different things. Here's the problem. We have 4 different people who tell the story of this last night, of the Last Supper. Matthew and Mark and John do not specifically tell us anything about whether Judas was there. But if you put on that fancy hat of Sherlock Holmes, and you get that pipe, and you say, I'm going to wear this cape, and I'm going to do some detective work, it is really pretty inarguable that you would come to the conclusion that Judas is not there. Like, we know that Judas was there at the start. We know that Judas is eating food, right? So he's part of the meal at some point. But we also know that Judas left at a certain point. And so it's really, it's almost impossible when you look at those 3 writings of this to come to any conclusion other than, Judas is already gone. Okay. So great, Judas isn't there. Except Luke does specifically tell us if Judas is there or he's not. And Luke specifically, in no uncertain terms, says Judas was definitely there at the institution of the Lord's Supper. Like he just says it. It's not a mystery at all. Like I would tell you to read it. It's Luke 22, but there's no point. I'm just telling you, he just said it. That's it. So now you're probably thinking, okay, well, why is this even a question? Well, here's the problem. Luke has this weird habit of not telling things in order. Like, he just loves, mixing up stories for his own, he has a point he wants to make, and so he mixes up a story in order to make that point. And so it's not that we don't trust Luke theologically, it's that we don't trust Luke chronologically, usually, sometimes, maybe. And that's the problem. You see, that's the problem when you lie sometimes, is it becomes a problem when, are you lying all the time? And I'm not saying Luke is lying, but when you mix up the story sometimes, it really begs the question, when is he not mixing up the story? Adding to the confusion over all of this is the wider New Testament. And this is where we start getting into why this matters. Because right about now, you should be asking yourself, why do I care? What's it matter? Well, here's why you should care. In the book of 1 Corinthians, the Apostle Paul is writing this letter to the church of Corinth. And he tells them that not everyone should take communion. very specifically in chapter 5. He talks about how while we take communion, we should never take communion with people who have this giant laundry list of sin. And basically, if people are not repenting of their sin, we shouldn't take communion with them. They should not be welcome at communion. That's about other people. In 1 Corinthians chapter 11, he actually talks about us as individuals. And he basically says you should not take communion yourself if you are doing it in an unworthy manner, which itself is a whole other conversation about what it means to, be taking the communion in an unworthy manner. But regardless, it's pretty obvious that Paul is excluding people from taking communion. Here's the logic. Who is actually allowed to take communion? And there's usually two answers given. Everybody, or the people we decide, which is great. On the everybody side, you will have people quoting Luke and saying, well, Luke says Judas is there. And if Jesus is serving Judas communion, you can't get worse than the guy who literally sold Jesus out and had him killed. You can't be a greater sinner than that. Luke just says what Luke says, and there we are. Therefore, if Judas is welcomed by Jesus at the first Lord's Supper, there is no grounds for us to bar anyone from the Lord's Supper. Goes argument A, which, like I said, is extremely popular and well known in the earliest part of the church. Over time, though, people looked at 1 Corinthians and said, well, it's pretty obvious that Paul is excluding people. And so it's pretty clear that, Luke, we can read Luke the way we read Luke. We can read Matthew, Mark, and John the way we read Matthew, Mark, and John. And quite frankly, it sounds like we can exclude people. And I'll tell you who we're to exclude is the people we'd like to exclude. And we have that argument of that side of the thing. And that, as I said, is much more popular in the modern sense of the word. Now, all of that being, I think, hopefully interesting, keeping your attention, it leads me to this. See, I'm not worried about I'm not too worried about other people. Maybe I'm selfish. I'm just not too worried. Whatever. Churches can do whatever, and people can do whatever, and people can think whatever. Here's my question. What does this mean for me? When am I allowed to take communion? When should I take communion? How do I know that, I'm worthy enough to do it? How do I know? If we're in the business of excluding people, how do I know when I'm excluded? How do I know when I'm included? And what does this tell me about my relationship with God? And what does this tell me about God's relationship to me? I am super selfish. I just think of myself here. Okay, so communion is offered at Ashland Christian Church every single week. And it's the way it is in lots of churches. It's every week in a lot of churches. And who is allowed? And how do I know that it's me? And if I take the position that Judas was there and I use that as evidence that then everybody's welcome, well, what am I supposed to do with 1 Corinthians? But if I take 1 Corinthians, what am I supposed to do with the fact that Luke very specifically tells me that the Judas was there? Even if he did it out of order. By the way, let's back up. Even if Luke tells the story out of order, he tells the story out of order specifically for you and I to read that Judas was there. His telling it out of order was to include Judas if he told it out of order. So either he told it in order and Judas was actually there, or he told it out of order so that you and I think that Judas is there. Either way, Luke wants us to see Judas. Man, what do we do? Now, what does this mean about how God thinks about me? And the whole point of communion. Am I just supposed to be sitting here insecure every week with communion? Wondering, am I doing this right? Full disclosure, this is very personal for me. I grew up in a church where that unworthy manner passage was quoted at communion once every 3 weeks. And it was always you better make sure that you're taking communion in a worthy manner. And I'm 15, and I'm what does that mean? I want to do that. I want to take communion in a worthy manner. I want to be welcomed by Jesus here. I want this to be good, but you're not giving me any instructions. You're just saying, be worthy, guys. And it's sort of like, imagine that you were to go to McDonald's, and it's like one of those old-timey speakers that you can't understand anything. And then the guy who's taking your order is Scottish, and he's an auctioneer. And you're like, hey, could you read back that order? And here's this Scottish auctioneer through the old-timey speaker trying to read back your order, and you're like, wait, was that my order? Am I at McDonald's? I was trying to be at Long John Silver's. Like, it's that. It's like, you're just like, this is, I mean, for me, it was like, this is all, and suddenly now communion's terrifying, guys. Now suddenly communion is a scary thing where it's like, you're not worthy, except you need to make sure that you are. And so look, I'm not going to answer any questions, guys. I don't know if you guys, any rule of thumb, anytime somebody tells you, here's this question that people have been asking since literally like the 200s, I have the answer, don't listen to that guy or gal. They don't have the answer. I don't have the answer here. I don't have the answer to this thing. I'm going to tell you what I think, but I don't have like a definitive answer that answers all the questions. So let's just start there. But I do think that by dumping all this on the table, much like we might do with a giant box of Legos, we can build something that can help us with communion and help us understand what we're even talking about here. And let's start that Lego building with a very old story about a golden calf. So it was 2 months. And the timing, guys, the timing is huge. It was about 2 months after the people of Israel were, after the Exodus, after they were set free in Egypt. 2 months later, they land at Mount Sinai. So imagine, the timing becomes important here for a minute. Okay, so in May, you are a slave in Egypt. All these plagues are happening. Moses is all, let my people go. You're one of the people. You get let go. You leave June 1st. June, July, on August 1st, you're at Mount Sinai. That's how quick these things are happening. So you land on Mount Sinai. And Moses tells you that God wants to make you his people, and that he's gonna make this covenant with you, and there's gonna be some rules to this covenant. He's gonna go up on the mountain, he's gonna get those rules, and he's gonna bring them back to you, and you're gonna say okay, or you're gonna say no thank you. Now, the reason this is going on, and the reason you agree to this as a Jewish person in August, even though you were in Egypt in May and you left in June, in August, the reason you agree to this is not because you have faith in God. In fact, you almost definitely, 100% do not have faith in God. And here's why. For 400 years, your people have been in Egypt. You barely have a concept of God outside of the Egyptian concept of God. I mean, how could you? You've lived your life. Your parents lived their life. They lived and died. Your grandparents lived and died. Your great-grandparents lived and died. Your great-grandparents, great-great-grandparents lived and died. I don't know how many generations are in 400 years, but it's a lot. Like, they all lived and died without knowing who God is. You didn't leave Egypt because God sent some plagues. That's not what happened. You left Egypt because Moses showed up with his brother Aaron, and they said, we're leading you to freedom. And you said, well, that sounds pretty good. Your faith is in Moses. That's who your faith is in. And I'm not saying it's bad. I'm not judging anybody. Of course your faith is in Moses. Of course it is. You don't know anything else. It's not like you went to Sunday school when you were building bricks, right? Like, you're out here building buildings. You're a literal slave being whipped out here if you don't work hard enough under the sun. It's not like you're like, let me read my Bible during all of this. Like, that's not what you do. Not it. So Mount Sinai. So Moses says, I'm going to go up here. I'm going to get some stuff. He comes back with the 10 Commandments. He comes back with some other stuff. He's like, hey, guys, do you want to be part of do you want to be one of God's people? And they're like, I don't know. Do you, Moses, think that we should be God's people? You tell us. Like, you're the one that we're following here. We're basically going to do what you tell us. Like, we've never made our own decisions. I'm 39 years old. I've never made a decision of my own. I'm just following you, man. And Moses is like, yeah, I think you guys should do this. And so people of Israel are like, yeah, absolutely. Let's do that. And they agree to be part of God's people, or to be God's people at this point, to be God's chosen people. And so they say, great, we're going to do that. Moses says, great, we're going to do that. Well, hold up. So God wants me to get more instruction. So I'm going to go back up the mountain. I'll be back. It'll be fine. Y'all just sit tight. I'll be back. And they're like, cool, Moses is gone. So, hypothetically, in May, you were in Egypt. You were a slave. You have no concept whatsoever of this God, whatever. But Moses shows up. The plagues happen. He says, let my people go. Pharaoh lets him go. You leave June 1st. You travel for 2 months. August 1st happens. And Moses leaves. And he's gone for 40 days, which is a fancy way of saying he's gone for more than half the time it took you to get out of Egypt and get to the mountain itself. Guys, that's a long time. Relatively speaking, of course. It's like this. So I was supposed to get something in the mail. It was shipped out in August, right? And they're like, it'll take 3 days to get here. And 3 days later, it was in Michigan. That was 4 weeks ago. It's in Michigan now. Guys, I've come up with all sorts of scenarios for that package. I don't know where I can only assume I'm never getting it. It will just stay in Michigan forever. It'll just be painted, the Michigan Wolverine, the blue and maize colors. It's just going to be Michigan. It's going to go to the sandy beaches of the Great Lakes. It's just, that package is gone. I have written that package off forever. And if you're telling me that you have not had a similar experience with both the mail and your brain telling you it's never coming, you're a liar. This happens to all of us. So imagine instead of a package, it's the guy that literally you uprooted your entire life for and followed. And he's stuck in Michigan. Except you can't get into your email and see that he's stuck in Michigan. He's just gone. And it took you 2 months to get here, and it's now day 37 of just sitting there waiting for the dude to come back. It's now mid-September. I mean, can you understand why they built a golden calf now? This was not this long story. When I was a kid, I hear this story and I think oh, it's just this long journey. No, guys, this was like a summer. This is all condensed into a summer. This is all condensed into half a baseball season. It's so it's like week 12 of the NFL season is happening and this story is done. It's all condensed. Moses is just gone. They don't know what to do. This is what we read in the book of Exodus. Chapter 32. It says, when the people saw how long it was taking Moses to come back down the mountain, they gathered on Aaron, his brother. They said, come on, they said, make us some gods who can lead us. We don't know what happened to this fellow Moses who brought us here from the land of Egypt. So Aaron said, take the gold rings from the ears of your wives and sons and daughters and bring them to me. All the people took the gold rings from their ears and brought them to Aaron. And Aaron took the gold, melted it down, and molded it into the shape of a calf. When the people saw it, they exclaimed, O Israel, these are the gods who brought you out of the land of Egypt. They're just looking for somebody to lead them. I mean, I'm not saying slavery was great, but it's all they ever knew. And it's sort of that the devil thing. We know they complain and want to go back to Egypt because they're at least we knew what was happening in Egypt. We have no idea what's happening here. And they go to Aaron, who, by the way, should know better. This guy's a prophet. This guy's a priest. This guy, because this guy is Moses' brother. He is super, he's number 2 in the story. The second most important guy. He's just oh, man, I bet Moses is dead. We should probably build a god. Let's do that out of gold. Bring me all the gold. And you can understand it. But if we can understand it, we can also understand why it's a problem. Because, see, they didn't build, a golden Ronald McDonald. They didn't build a golden, tree. They didn't build a golden Easter Island head. You know, like they could have built a lot of golden stuff. The golden calf is specific. It's actually to a specific deity. His name is Apis. He's an Egyptian god. Because of course they did. You know? Of course they did. They don't know who God is outside of the framework of 400 years of slavery. So they build an Egyptian god and they say, well, that's the God that gave us freedom, which is absurd because that's the God that kept them in slavery for 400 years, according to the Egyptians. But they don't know what else to do. They don't know what else to say. They are totally, totally lost. And as it turns out, totally, totally sinful. They are broken people. And the specificity of their sin is alarming. It's alarming how specific this is. Let's rewind. If this is in September, again, hypothetically, let's go back to May. Let's go back to the end of May, basically the day before June 1st, which is May 31st, I think. Let's go back to May 31st. The 10th plague is a different plague than the first 9. God is passive in this plague. Or God's sending stuff. This time, that's not what's happening. There's an angel of death coming. And God says, here's the deal. The angel of death is going to do what angels of death do. The angel of death is going to kill. It's going to kill the firstborn of all the animals, of all the people. It's going to kill. I can protect you if you make the choice to be different. See, I'm judging Egypt, and I'm judging the deities of Egypt by what's going to happen here. You can be different. Make your choice. Here's how you make that choice. Get a lamb, get a goat. I don't care. Pick one. Lamb or goat. Kill it, drain its blood, and you have dinner. We're not killing for no reason. We're going to eat it. See, and I always feel like that's going to be delicious. Just as an aside. I don't want to. Just feels like it's going to be delicious. Barbecue, ancient Egyptian, Jewish fusion food. I want you to kill the animal. I want you to drain its blood. I want you to put the blood on the door frame. If you do that, then I'll accept that you're different and you're mine, and that's what we'll do. Now, I don't want to go too deep into the story because it's disturbing and brings up a lot of other questions. But I will say this. At the core of the story is God setting people free from a tyrant who has enslaved them for centuries. And that's true. And that's how we should understand it to a certain degree. But this is, in fact, what the book of Exodus tells us that God says is at the core of this. In Exodus chapter 12, at the core of what we're talking about, this is what we read. God says, I will execute judgment against all the gods of Egypt, for I am the Lord. This was God showing that the deities that the Egyptians worshipped and believed in and made sacrifices to were not more powerful than him. Period. It's a high stakes contest, essentially. And God is saying, I want you to choose my side, for I am the Lord. I am the Lord. You follow me, not them. Every single person who ate that Passover meal, every single one, was committing to saying, we will be different. We will be committed. We are not worshiping the gods of Egypt. We will worship the Lord. Every single person made that commitment on May 31st. And by mid-September, they are not only building an idol of an Egyptian deity, but they are saying that the God of the Passover is that Egyptian deity. They are declaring that the God of the Passover, the winner of this contest, is Egypt. See, the golden calf, I get it. Like, I get why it happened. But it's also, it's not too far to say it's Israel's greatest sin. I mean, y'all can't be faithful for like 3 months. Like, you couldn't even make it to Christmas. Like, y'all don't even have Christmas. You couldn't make it to the holiday you don't have. 3 months later, you are already taking back everything in the Passover. You're undoing everything in the Passover. You're saying to God, I don't want it. Which is a really fancy way of just me saying this. That very first Passover was given for really terrible people. I mean, they were also victims and slaves, and I'm not all that aside, sinful people. The first Passover was for sinful people, the sorts of folks who are going to turn their backs on God like that. That's who the first Passover was given for. Passover was for sinners, which makes a great deal of sense. This whole scenario, this angel of death here, right? Like, they couldn't take care of that. They couldn't fight that. They couldn't whatever. They were weak. They were in need of saving. And so God saves them. By definition, that's the situation that they're in. But Passover is not for good people who are worthy of eating it. Not at all. Passover is by definition for unworthy people who are given grace and love from God, who understands that they're unworthy and doesn't care because he loves them anyway. That's Passover. And on the night he was betrayed, Jesus had a Passover meal with his friends, who were his family. A reminder to them of those events and that truth. That God saved them because they needed saving. That these were sinful people who would turn their backs on him, and God loved them anyway. That's Passover. And Jesus says, now, you guys get Passover. None of this is new to y'all. We're going to build on that. Like the Lego house. We're going to build on it. This is my body. Not the Passover lamb anymore. This is my blood, not a goat. And you know who the angel of death is? It's people. I'm going to be murdered tomorrow. And according to Luke, the chief murderer is sitting right there listening. I think Judas was there. For one, I have no reason to argue with Luke, and I don't know why people do. It's very odd. Like, it's so weird to be like, well, I don't think you told it in order. That's super weird. Like, I know we have other problems, but, like, that's just the Bible. The Bible is just filled with, like, well, what do we do with this? And we've got this. So, like, that's just reading the Bible, by the way. Luke is as crystal clear as he can be. But also, guys, I don't know what to do with 1 Corinthians exactly, other than to just say this. The Passover is about sinful people who know they need God. And communion is greater than that. Communion is better than Passover. It's not a step backwards. It's not less grace and less mercy and less love. It's more. I think Judas was there. And I think that shows us that, quite frankly, communion, more than anything else, is for sinful people who come to the table understanding we need God. And so we take communion as a reminder of our deep need for God. In faith that God is love that is greater than any sin. that we are accepted, that we are loved, that Christ is enough, that it's not about us being worthy in the first, it was never about us being worthy in the first place. It was about the act of Christ in the first place. We don't come to communion and say, well, I guess I'm worthy now. We come to communion saying Christ has done this. It's his body. It's his blood. He has invited us. And that's not just how we operate in communion. That's how we should be operating in the entirety of our faith. Understanding that the entirety of our faith is about Christ and his mercy and compassion and love. And I can't prove that Judas was there. I can't know for sure. We've been arguing about this for 1,800 years. I think he was, but this is what I do know. Let's just move the goalpost a little bit. That's how we argue in 2021, right? This is what John says at the very beginning, the very start of the Last Supper conversation. It's in John chapter 13. It says, before the Passover celebration, Jesus knew that his hour had come to leave this world and return to his Father. He had loved his disciples during his ministry on earth, and now he loved them to the very end. It was time for supper. And the devil had already prompted Judas, son of Simon Iscariot, to betray Jesus. Jesus knew that the Father had given him authority over everything, and that he had come from God and would return to God. So he got up from the table, took off his robe, wrapped a towel around his waist, and poured water into a basin. Then he began to wash the disciples' feet, drying them with the towel he had around him. Maybe Judas already left before the institution of the Lord's Supper. But for darn sure, 100%, inarguably, he had not left for this. Jesus knew that Judas was going to betray him. Says it right there. He knew he was going to do it that night. Says it right there. He could do anything. He has all authority and everywhere. He can do whatever he wants. Says it right there. So what does he do? He dramatically, almost inappropriately, when we understand ancient foot washing, well, that's a whole other sermon, but scandalously shows love to Judas. Because that's how God operates. Where God sees love, he returns. Where God sees sin, he answers it with love. Period. That's how he treated Judas. Jesus showed love to Judas to the end. He knew what he was going to do, and he washed his feet. You know, that's the sort of guy who would also serve him communion. And each and every week at Ashland Christian Church, we take communion. By the way, this whole sermon is just basically a 35-minute communion meditation, I suppose. We take communion every week. And here's what I want us to think about. Whatever the people say, obviously, think about what they're saying. But also, like, as we move forward, understand this about what communion is. Communion is about God's love for sinful people. God cannot help but answer sin with love because God is love that is greater than any sin. Communion, these emblems are Christ showing us dramatically how that happens. And we don't come to the table when we're worthy. We don't come to the table when we're ready. We don't come to the table ever. We come to the table when we understand that we are sinful, that we are like the people of the Passover, that we're to deny Jesus over and over and over and over and over, that we're to turn our backs on him in 3 months and build another God and say, well, God didn't save us. It was Egypt that saved us. The people of the Passover were sinful. The people sitting there, by the way, Judas is not the only sinner here. I always find that fascinating that we set Judas apart when Peter's going to deny Jesus 3 times. Everybody else is going to run away. Everyone else runs away. They're all cowards. Not a good friend in the group. Yeah, in the same way, I'd run away. I'd deny Jesus because we're sinful people. And God's answer to sin is love. And when we take communion, that's why I'm so glad we do it every week, because we need this reminder every week that we come to the table as people who sin, who need God. And God meets us at that table with love and compassion and mercy, just as he always has, because that's who he is. This morning, we're in our second week, third week, whatever week of our series called Water and Blood. We're talking about baptism, we're talking about communion. The two things that unite every Christian. And as we talk about Passover and Judas and the first Lord's Supper, this is what we learn from that. Our third lesson from Water and Blood is this. Communion reminds us that our sin does not define us, because God is love greater than any and all sins. Communion reminds us that our sin does not define us, because God is love greater than any and all sins. The musicians going forward, we're going to sing a song. We offer an invitation each and every week to take God up on this, just to embrace that love that he has for us. If you've never made that decision of doing that, it entails repenting and being baptized. It sounds like two things. It's really just one. In baptism, it's a picture of that change that we undergo in our repentance. The Bible teaches that as we go under the water, we get out of the water. It's like ourselves being put to death and raised from the dead, united with Christ. And we are forgiven and made new. You never made a decision? Nice warm baptistry, let's talk. If you're an immersed believer in Christ, looking for a perfect church home, that's not it, but we do serve a perfect God. We want to connect, we want to call, we want to cultivate, we want to meet new people, we want to share the gospel, we want to grow up while we do it. And we want to understand each and every week, as we worship, as we pray, as we come to the table of communion, that we are people who sin. We need God. And God is there every single time that we need him. As we stand,